So here we're going to go through a fun walkthrough of the diencephalon. So we're going to talk about the thalamus, hypothalamus, and then the pituitary gland and hormone release. So this overview of the diencephalic anatomy. We have a mid-sagittal view here, midbrain and the colliculi, and then here's the thalamus right here. Thalamus has nuclei and fiber tracts. The metathalamus is this medial geniculate and lateral geniculate nuclei. Remember, medial, auditory, lateral vision. And then with the subthalamus, remember the subthalamic nucleus. If it's injured, there's this hemiballismus, this wild ballistic flinging movements. And here is myelin staining of this mid-sagittal section of the brain with the thalamus right back in here. With the hypothalamus, we can call out the mammillary bodies, which are really important for memory. And then we can call out this infundibulum and neural lobe. And then the adenohypophysis, along with the neural lobe, the neural hypophysis form this pituitary gland here. With the epithalamus, we think about the pineal gland for melatonin production and release. This is critical for sleep initiation. And then this is just coronal view here with the thalamus, and right underneath it, the subthalamus there. Hippocampus anatomy and physiology, we're actually going to combine in a moment for memory circuitry, but this is just a detailed anatomy of the hippocampus. A couple things to point out. Cornu ammonis region 1 is really important for hypoxic ischemic injury. It seems to be particularly vulnerable to hypoxia. And then remember, this medial temporal lobe can herniate over the tentorium cerebelli here. And then when it comes to physiology, we have the PAPE circuit here and the perforant pathway. But we're going to bring this information along with the anatomy together for a simplistic overview of memory. So the limbic lobe has an amygdala for the center for emotion, and then the hippocampus is the center for memory. It's the file clerk, and we'll see what that means in a moment. Here's the amygdala anterior to the hippocampus. Amygdala refers to almond-shaped. So we have an experience, and the hippocampus wants to help us remember it. So it processes the experience in this limbic lobe here, in this circuit, in the PAPE circuit. As it does, the information itself is stored in various brain regions and relevant regions. So visual information, a visual memory, is going to be stored in the occipital lobe. A location memory is going to be stored in the parietal lobe. And then when it comes to retrieval, those lobes then ask the hippocampus where exactly the file is, and there's an interaction between those lobes in the brain and the hippocampus to retrieve that piece of information. The prefrontal cortex acts on the hippocampus as well, and there's this helpful heuristic where lateral is logistical or task sequencing, inferior for impulse control, there's disinhibition if there's injury to the inferior prefrontal cortex, and then medial for motivation. If there's injury there, there's abulia, a lack of motivation. When it comes to the hypothalamus here, there's a very helpful heuristic where anteromedial, think parasympathetic, meaning rest and digest, and posterolateral, think sympathetic for fight or flight. So this is the center for autonomic nervous system, the central brain region for the autonomic nervous system. We can find it right next to the third ventricle. So on scans, it's easiest to find the hypothalamus if you identify the third ventricle. It has this medial zone here and then this lateral zone. And then we have this mid-sagittal view here, and you can walk through this tutorial in detail on the site, but it goes through all the different hypothalamic nuclei. And then we're going to get into the details of the pituitary gland because it's so fundamental for clinical medicine. Here are the anterior lobe hormones and then the posterior lobe hormones. We use that acronym FLAT PIG for the anterior lobe hormones, FSH, LH, ACTH, TSH, prolactin, and growth hormone. And then for the posterior lobe hormones, vasopressin, also known as ADH or antidiuretic hormone, and then oxytocin. So let's go through the physiology of the anterior lobe first. This is a helpful setup. So there is a prolactin releasing hormone out of the hypothalamus, It acts on lactotrophs, which secrete prolactin, which then acts on the target organ, the mammary glands. And then dopamine in this instance is the inhibitory hormone. It inhibits this activation. So let's walk through the anterior lobe here. So there is a primary capillary plexus and a secondary capillary plexus. This is also known as the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal blood vessels. So here are the hypothalamic neurons. Here's their cell bodies and their axons. There's release of the hypothalamic hormone, which would be the prolactin releasing hormone. It acts on these cells here in the anterior pituitary, which would be the lactotrophs. And then there's release of this hormone itself, which would be the prolactin. And then that goes into the bloodstream and acts on the target organ, the mammary glands. In contrast, the posterior lobe is much simpler. There's this hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. So there's a neural setup here where the cell body stimulates release, and that release simply stimulates the release of the hormone into the bloodstream. So that's a quick run through of the diencephalon. A lot of really important anatomy there for memory, emotion, sensory integration, and then also the hypothalamus and pituitary gland being the center for autonomic function within the central nervous system.